We all know the story of the Titanic, the unsinkable ship that tragically sank on its maiden voyage in April 1912. But what if the real story behind its sinking isn't as simple as a collision with an iceberg? What if there's more to the Titanic disaster than we've been told? What if the Titanic was doomed before it even hit that iceberg? Today, we're diving deep into the shocking truth about what really sank the Titanic. Buckle up, because the story you thought you knew is about to change forever. It's one of the most famous tragedies in history. Over 1,500 lives lost as the Titanic sank to the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. The ship, once hailed as the unsinkable vessel, struck an iceberg and broke apart in the early hours of April 15th, 1912. For years, we've been taught that the iceberg was the single cause of the Titanic's fate. But the more we look at the details, the more it seems like that iceberg was just the final blow. So what if the Titanic was already doomed? What if a series of overlooked mistakes, hidden flaws, and unfortunate circumstances led to this disaster? Let's uncover the truth. 1. The iceberg, not the only problem. Let's start with the iceberg itself. Yes, the Titanic collided with it, and yes, that caused the ship to flood. But the iceberg didn't just magically sink the Titanic. In fact, experts have pointed out that the ship might have survived the impact if it had been built differently. The Titanic had 16 watertight compartments, designed to keep the ship afloat even if several were damaged. But here's the catch. The bulkhead separating these compartments didn't go all the way up to the deck. When the iceberg punctured the hull, water flooded from one compartment to another, spreading through the ship like a domino effect. Why was the design like this? Some believe it was due to cost-cutting measures. The Titanic was, after all, a luxury liner, and the White Star Line, which built the ship, wanted to cut corners to make it more profitable. But here's a darker truth. The Titanic was not built to survive a catastrophic event like this. The compartments were supposed to act as barriers, but the failure of the design meant that the Titanic's fate was sealed the moment it hit the iceberg. In other words, the ship's designers might have been too confident in their unsinkable claims. Could it be that the Titanic was always set up for failure by the people who built it? Were they too eager to make a statement about luxury and speed, ignoring critical safety precautions? 2. The speeding Titanic racing into disaster. Another shocking truth is the speed at which the Titanic was traveling that fateful night. Despite warnings from other ships in the area about icebergs, the Titanic was still racing through the icy waters of the North Atlantic at around 22 knots, just below its maximum speed of 24 knots. Why? It seems that Captain Edward Smith, who was regarded as an experienced and trusted leader, was determined to break records. The Titanic was already a marvel of its time, and there was immense pressure to show off its capabilities on the maiden voyage. But the speed, combined with the fact that the ship's lookouts didn't have binoculars, another glaring oversight, meant that they couldn't see the iceberg in time to avoid it. The Titanic was sailing full speed ahead, and with the iceberg spotted too late, there was no chance to make a sharp turn or slow down. What if the Titanic had slowed down? What if the lookouts had been better equipped? Could the disaster have been avoided? 3. The flawed material, a brittle problem. Now, let's talk about another factor that could have played a major role in the sinking: the ship's steel hull. In recent years, scientists have uncovered shocking details about the quality of the metal used in the Titanic's construction. It turns out that the steel used for the Titanic's hull was made with a high sulfur content, which made it more brittle in cold temperatures. This means that when the Titanic hit the iceberg, the metal broke more easily than it should have. In fact, some experts believe that if the ship's steel had been of a better quality, the iceberg might not have caused the same kind of damage. But here's the kicker. It wasn't just the steel. The rivets that held the hull together may have also been made from substandard materials. Researchers suggest that these weak rivets could have popped out upon impact, causing even more flooding. So, the ship's materials were flawed from the start, making it more susceptible to a disaster once that iceberg struck. If the Titanic had been built with stronger materials, would the iceberg have caused less damage, or could it have survived the crash? The lifeboat shortage. A deadly oversight. One of the most shocking truths about the Titanic's sinking was the lifeboat shortage. The ship was only equipped with enough lifeboats for about half of its passengers, and they weren't even fully loaded during the evacuation. Why? Part of the reason was regulations. The Titanic was built before modern maritime laws required enough lifeboats for every person on board. But there's also evidence that the Titanic's designers didn't think the lifeboats were necessary for a ship that was unsinkable. They were, in effect, an afterthought. And when disaster struck, it was too late to correct the mistake. Survivors from the Titanic recall the chaos that followed as the lifeboats were lowered without enough people to fill them, while passengers were left behind in freezing waters, waiting for a rescue that didn't come in time. If the Titanic had enough lifeboats for everyone, could more lives have been saved? Was the real disaster not the iceberg, but the utter lack of preparedness for an emergency? The fatalistic mindset. Unsinkable hubris. And then there's the most shocking truth of all, the hubris surrounding the Titanic itself. The ship's designers, builders, and even the passengers believed it was unsinkable. When you have that kind of overconfidence, you stop thinking about worst-case scenarios. The Titanic wasn't just another ship. It was an icon of luxury and engineering triumph. The problem with that kind of thinking? It made everyone on board complacent. There were no serious drills. There were no preparations for a real emergency, and the passengers themselves felt safe to the point of neglecting basic safety procedures. Could the tragedy of the Titanic have been prevented if its creators had simply been more cautious? Were they so blinded by their own pride that they couldn't see the dangers right in front of them? So what really sank the Titanic? It wasn't just the iceberg, it was a combination of flawed design, cost-cutting measures, hubris, and poor decisions that set the stage for disaster. The iceberg was just the final trigger in a series of missteps that doomed the ship from the very beginning. When we look at the Titanic sinking, it's easy to point to the iceberg and say, that's what did it. But the real story is far more complex and terrifying. So, the next time you hear about an unsinkable ship or a flawless plan, ask yourself, what are the hidden dangers we're not seeing?